Our fourth reason to believe that there is a God is ought. And ought is very much like the word should. It implies there's a moral weight, there's a moral thrust, there's a you ought to, you ought not. And so reason number 4, there are actual universal oughts and ought nots, or shoulds and should nots. You should do this and you should not do this. Fyodor Dostoevsky, in his well-known famous novel, regarded by many as the greatest novel ever written, The Brothers Karamazov, said in that novel, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. If there is no God, if there is no transcendent anchor for morality, then you can do whatever you want. And who is to suggest otherwise? Who's to tell you that you're wrong? And yet here comes Scripture. And Scripture says very plainly and very powerfully that the invitation to holiness has a reason. The invitation to righteousness has a reason. The invitation to selflessness has a reason. And what is that reason? Leviticus chapter 11, verse 45. God says, therefore be holy. Why? Because I am holy. There is the moral impetus. There is the moral gravitas. Also in Leviticus 11, love your neighbor as yourself because I said so. I made you that way. I created you that way. There's a moral imperative here. To put it very simply, there's a way you ought to act and there's a way you ought not to act. Jesus was questioned about this. What is the great commandment? And he himself said in Matthew chapter 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second, he said, is very similar to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets, all the Scripture hang on these two ideas, that there are oughts and there are ought nots. You ought to behave like this, and you ought not to behave like this. In fact, Scripture goes even a little further than behave. Scripture says you ought to think like this, and you ought not to think like this. There's moral parameters and boundaries even within our own private mental life. Scripture says so. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, this was a book that was absolutely transformative in my intellectual journey, my journey to becoming a follower of Jesus. Reading this book in my early 20s and getting to chapter 3 where Lewis describes the idea of a moral law, of a should, of an ought. And he says this, the first thing to get clear about Christian morality is that in this department, Christ did not come to teach any brand new morality. So that's the first thing you got to get in your mind. Jesus didn't come to teach some new concept or some brand new idea. No. The golden rule of the New Testament, do as you would be done by. Do unto others as you would have them do to yourself. Notice what he says. Is a summing up of what everyone at bottom had always known to be right. What Lewis is saying here, and if time allowed, I could show you that Scripture says everyone has an intuitive, internal, incorrigible sense in which we know there is a way we ought to behave and a way we ought not to behave. And when we behave in ways that we ought not, we are racked, quite without somebody telling us that we've done wrong, we are racked with shame and guilt and a sense of our having violated the world around us or the person around us. We know it. We don't have to be told. Lewis says, everybody at bottom knows. But there is, of course, a crucial difference between what actually is in the world and what ought to be. We all know this. Not many days ago, what was the man's name? Brenton Tarrant, a 28-year-old man that was born not far from here in Grafton, decided to walk into 2 mosques in Christchurch and shoot people, many people, killing 50 individuals. I think all of us in this room, and I strongly suspect that 99.999% of us outside of this room would say something like this. We would be very comfortable with this moral standard. We would say, he ought not to have done that. He should not have done that. There is, of course, that clip there that maybe you have seen where just as Brenton is walking up to the mosque, he is greeted, and he's greeted with the word brother. Welcome, brother. The last word that man spoke before he was gunned down was brother. And to add insult to injury, to twist the knife, to throw salt and lemon juice into the wound, not only did he do this horrific, terrible, morally insensible, demonic act, he live streamed it. others could see. And this is the world we live in. And yet, I imagine that all of you would be very comfortable saying, and I imagine the vast majority of people in the world would be very comfortable saying, he should not have done that. That wasn't just a preferential issue like super salad, pizza or pasta blue or green. No. That was wrong. He ought not to have done that. And Lewis says we all know that there's a way that things are, there's a way that the thing is, and then there's the way that it ought to be. What is that 50 people were left dead in that mosque, shot down by a right-wing radical, but that's what is, but that's not what should have been. There's an ought. There's a should. There's a moral imperative. I love the way that Lewis puts this, also in Mere Christianity. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. There is a tune that we should be playing, and God's moral tune is really simple. He said it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And the second is very similar. It's a very similar tune. It's to love your neighbor as yourself.